Hi, everyone, and welcome to reality. I'm Lev here with William today.
How are you?
I'm doing great. Today, we're going to talk about autism. We're interested in the history of it, the causes of it, and how to think of it. We've been interested in it and we've been talking about it. So we want to share some of our ideas here. There's a lot to say about autism and throughout time. I mean, in recent times, there's been a lot as far as vaccines causing autism and all that nonsense. But then for a long time, it never existed in a way. Anyways, we're going to get into that. Do you have any thoughts, William, for now?
Yes, just recently started getting interested in this topic. I don't know a whole lot about it, but I believe it relates to some other subjects I'm interested in, such as concept formation and language development, free will, and all sorts of related topics. So I think this is an interesting disorder to explore and investigate. I think that it's perhaps some critical information or critical knowledge I need, to understand other aspects of my studies. So that's mainly why I'm curious about autism. Also, I've known some autistic people in real life and had some relationships with autistic people. So I feel like I have some firsthand experience, but I never really gave it much critical thought. So I do want to start thinking about it in a critical way.
Yeah, in what way do you think it would apply to concept formation? Never really thought about that.
I think that this is just me brainstorming because I really only have like a vague understanding of how it might relate. But I think that they're both cognitive issues. I think that concept formation is integral to the health of your cognitive faculty. So if autism is a problem with thinking then and cognitive development, then it could, relate or have some sort of effect on concept formation. So I think the two might go together or be associated or,
Yeah,
have some relationship there. So I'm interested in that connection and, to really explore that idea and see if there's some issue there. And what I've noticed with autistic people is that they do a lot of things, that are normal, unless they're severely autistic. The more high functioning autistic people, they have a lot of normal traits and they can get along, in society very well. But then there are certain things they do, like not really understanding certain things other people do, little minor social problems. Then that's where the autistic part kind of is noticeable. But in terms of thinking and just functioning in life, they're very normal. So I think that at the high functioning level, there's a weird normalcy to it that I don't understand how that's possible if autism is an actual like core problem. It seems like
might be better to approach it from a different direction. I mean, in the first place, why is it considered a disorder? I mean, maybe those are borderline cases, like high functioning, but we don't derive the idea of autism from those people. I mean, as you're telling me about the history, I initially thought it was a type of schizophrenia, or they called it something like that because people were unsure what it was. They just knew it was a strange way of thinking, as particularly for, I think, more severe cases before it was like given a name. You have like Hans Asperger that made the name autism to describe these classes of characteristics and behaviors.
right before it was really understood, at a research and clinical level. I think they took it as some incurable or untreatable abnormality in development, and they basically put these people away in institutions and let them die, which is pretty sad. That probably comes from a lack of interest in scientific development, before before psychology became a real science. So I think that in the beginning, it was thought of like a psychotic disorder, and it probably is to a certain degree. It's treated, I think, with antipsychotics. I think those help.
Well, I'd be careful with that phrase, psychotic, because antipsychotics can treat many things. It's not necessarily even with psychotic thinking. It'd be better to characterize it as like an abnormal thinking or atypical thinking, because psychotic is really a very specific kind of abnormality, which, yeah, is more maladaptive and more a complete detachment from reality, rather than, say, a difficulty understanding reality.
Right. Yeah. Psychotic probably doesn't apply to it in general. I think that, but do you think that the more severe cases could be classified as psychotic because they're just completely dissociated from society?
I'm doubtful that they'd be associated from reality. I mean, that's always hard to say, but I mean, they're still functioning in a more normal way. I mean, they can know how to eat food and whatnot. It's not like a true psychotic breakaway, like nothing about reality even makes any sense. You couldn't even function in a basic way because your mind isn't even working at all. I mean, it'd be more like a limitation of thinking, not a way of thinking that's wrong. They're lacking a capacity rather than something being present that is wrong or bad.
Well, what would distinguish a psychotic disorder from an autistic disorder?
Psychotic disorders usually have two types of traits. First, the positive traits being as something that wasn't there before, that during the psychotic episode, there's these additional characteristics, like in schizophrenia, it'd be like word salad. Normally they don't talk like that, but during an episode, you'll speak in word salad. It's a thing that's present that indicates a psychotic episode. And that's like something you add on to their processing, that during this event, and there's negative traits, which are things you lose when you're in a psychotic episode. Say people lose affect, or people lose, say, memory skills go down. They lose their capacities to some extent. So, I mean, there's of course crossover when it gets stranger, when there's maybe you lack some capacities. It adds difficulty, but it's not like unable to identify what reality is. And that's part of it too.
So you speak of a psychotic episode. So there are times where a psychotic wouldn't be psychotic. They would have a normal life,
Yes.
but then something triggers them and they go into this disassociated, So an autistic person is pretty much the same way all the time, right?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, they lack certain capacities, or there is something present there. It's just that way always. It's not like there's an episode or a trigger. This is just how the mind functions. I suppose say schizophrenia, like, it's how their mind functions, but there's certain episodes that happen that make things more severe, and you manage the episodes. Like if you're saying like had, I don't know, any other kind of physical disorder, say, asthma, sometimes you have an attack, so you take the medication, but not that you're always in that symptom. So then when psychotic disorders are more like that, while developmental disorder like autism is like a thing you always have, but you can adapt to it.
Okay. Let's see. Why don't we get more into the history just to provide context? So my understanding is that obviously there were probably autistic people before the first diagnosis, and they wasn't well understood, and they were just social outcasts and thrown into institutions. But then when people started taking these things more seriously and psychology became a thing, they started diagnosing autism in the I think the 1930s or 40s. The first one I saw was Donald Triplett was diagnosed somewhere around 1943 by Leo Kanner. He was a kid at the time, like 3 or 4 years old, and his mother started noticing his fixation on objects and weird memorization abilities, and that he was unsociable and very nervous. So these are like some of the initial traits that they noticed, these psychiatrists or psychologists. And Leo Kanner was also treating other kids with these symptoms. And so he noticed this pattern. And I guess he was one of the first people to diagnose an autistic person. Do you have any other historical examples or like context for the history of that?
Nothing more than that. Just that back then, one of the reasons given for autism was like, it was called refrigerator moms, where the idea was that moms were not paying enough attention to their children, and that was leading to autism. And that was a very simple idea, but that's where people began.
So moms were cold. Is that why they called them refrigerator moms?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
And yeah, because it was also new technology, so it was a way to make it the in thing, I guess, to explain.
In one of the treatments I was reading about, they would wrap people in cold sheets and immobilize them.
Jeez.
I don't know if that's related to refrigerator moms or not, but that was a treatment for people who are violent or like self-inflicting wounds on themselves.
Yeah.
So the sheets would immobilize them, but I don't really understand why they would have to be cold sheets. So that's an interesting aspect of it.
Yeah. See, in the past 30 years, there's been a lot of developments in treatments and ways of handling it that have gotten much better and are sensible and helps make them more functional, helps them develop much better.
Yeah, in terms of the history, there's the argument that incidences of autism have been increasing over the last 60 or 70 years. There was a dramatic increase between the mid 1900s and early 2000s of autism. So I was wondering if that's most likely due to just new ways of diagnosing it and understanding it. And so now they're just catching more and more cases of it. Or do you think there's an actual increase going on and this problem's getting worse?
Based on what I studied, I think it's the diagnosis criteria. People are much better at it. Not to mention now it's not as severe necessarily. Autism spectrum now, which can help diagnosis, but it also broadens what people that could be considered autistic. So you're both increasing the amount of people you count and the effectiveness of the diagnosis. So naturally that would go up. Although it would make sense that if average age of mothers is increasing and autism rate is increasing, and we know other disorders like Down syndrome increase in likelihood as a mother grows in age, like after 40 especially. I think that's reason to think that it's part of the cause, but I don't think that'd be the main cause. I really think it's more about the diagnosis procedure than it is the actual true rate of illness.
I've read that the maternal age increasing over time might account for a small percentage of the increased incidences of autism, like 5% or something like that.
Yeah, that would sound reasonable.
Yeah, I haven't really, investigated that stat. So, but I've read that. I do note that there does seem to be a correlation between maternal age increase. Like when a mother has her first child, her age has been increasing over time. You know, in the medieval times, you have a kid when you're like right out of puberty, but now women are waiting until late 20s or 30s to have a kid. So
Yeah.
that's been increasing over time. But also, if you accept the idea that incidences of autism are increasing, then there's a correlation there. But I guess there'd have to be more evidence that the incidences are actually increasing.
Yeah, that's the issue in diagnosis, I think, is always often the issue. Because how do you say if you're thinking wrong? But we're not talking about like there's a test you can do. It has to be done by observation, strictly behavior, and that's prone to error. So it's really hard to judge that.
Yeah, and in terms of other causes, I've read that there's a twin study that shows environmental factors contribute more to the cause than genetic factors.
Yeah.
I guess they've looked at twins, and one twin will be autistic and the other won't. So that suggests it's an environmental problem, and not genetic.
Well, it's just the degree of genetic impact, which would be just to say that environment seems to have a greater impact, but it's interaction between the two. I mean, I think usually that's the case when it's environmental cause. Usually it's something about the genetics that interact with the environment in a particular way. Like you have certain capacities, they interact with the world differently. I mean, like obviously if you can't think about social things as well, if caused by something genetic, I mean, you might not show you'll show certain abilities or lack of abilities that would be expected normally, which would be environmental, which might have to do with like how you're taught or what skills you're given to develop social skills.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's such a complex disorder that
Right.
I'm sure there's some combination of factors there,
Yeah.
both genetic and environmental. I could see that. I've also read that it's possibly related to a defect in one of the chromosomes. Have you heard anything about that?
Not really. I heard the fact, but that's it.
Okay. So one of the things while we were talking before this that you mentioned is the Sally Ann test. And
Mhm.
this is a test that's designed to gauge a child's ability to attribute false beliefs to other people,
Mhm.
or like kind of understand their perspective.
Yeah,
Did you want to describe the test, or should I?
I'll describe it. So typically there's a child and they watch a video or watch in real life that a child, they're shown that a child likes this toy. Then somebody hides the toy and they try to see, does the child know where to look for the toy? Like, will they realize that? Will they look for where the toy was supposed to be or where it was hidden? So some autistic children think a toy is just going to be hidden where the adult put it, as if everybody knows what the autistic child knows. Like the idea that like children usually don't think that everybody knows what they know. So the idea would be that autistic kids are the same way, but they can't figure out that a hidden toy is actually being hidden. And so they'll guess that where the other child would look for the toy would be where the adult hid it, rather than trying to say, oh, the child doesn't actually see or didn't realize that it was hidden. So he's going to look where it was supposed to be and find out it wasn't there. So autistic children fail at that test. I mean, any child fails at that until about like 3 years old. But at 4 years old, it's easy for them. But autistic children, they still fail at 4 years old and onward after that. They can learn how, but it's difficult for them. They don't learn it naturally. Most kids learn that naturally, like where to look where something's hidden.
Yeah, this test I think was created by Simon Baron Cohen, or he published on the test in 1985.
Yeah.
And he used a marble, I think, in that example. So, they would hide a marble. A kid would have a marble toy and put it in a basket or something, and then they would leave the kid would leave the room, so they wouldn't know that the adult moved the marble. And then when the kid came in, they would think, the autistic kid who was observing all of this would think that the kid who left the room would find the marble where it was in the new basket, in the new basket or whatever. So it's really just a test to see if you can imagine the perspective of someone who's ignorant of knowledge that you have. So the results of that test were interesting because not all of the autistic kids failed. There were a few, that figured it out. So it doesn't seem like it's a perfect test to detect autism, because some of them could succeed in the test, and then also some unimpaired kids would fail the test.
Mhm.
So it's interesting to me that it's not a perfect test. It doesn't clearly establish whether the kid is autistic or not. Like if you didn't know the kid was autistic, if they hadn't been diagnosed and you were just sampling random kids, you wouldn't be able to tell which one's autistic by just doing the test.
Yeah, that's always a difficult thing about behavioral tests, because there's always something that maybe even the child thought of that you never thought of, that they're actually responding to something that's actually quite innovative or interesting in itself. So yeah, you can't use them absolutely, but they do indicate patterns. So we could talk about autism abstractly, but in a particular individual, that's where it gets really difficult. And what makes somebody autistic? How does it affect their identity? We could find general patterns, but what about their particular thinking style that allows them, to think effectively or overcome their issues? So at least we can see that there's a pattern, but what we don't know is how individuals deal with that pattern within themselves. Just even if you say every autistic child has that difficulty, maybe some children still manage to find a solution, which I think is the most interesting part. How do people adapt to their own disabilities?
I'm not sure how old these kids were in the test. Maybe they were different ages.
Usually 3 to 6 years old is common
Okay.
for those.
You were saying that children under 3 or 4 would normally fail the test because
Yeah.
they haven't developed this ability to imagine someone else's perspective.
Right. Yeah, it's not usually till like about 3.5 or 4 that they become able to do this.
This matches my own experience, because the story I always tell about, when my first memory is when my mother left me at daycare and I realized that she was leaving me.
Yeah.
And then I distinctly had this concept of me and her being separated from me. And so that caused an emotional reaction in me and I got upset. That was around 3 or 4 years old. So I think that relates to this test. At a certain point in your development, you go from seeing everything as just one thing that you're experiencing, and everybody is like a part of you, or an extension of you. And then suddenly you realize you're an individual and you're a self. And then other people become distinct things. And then that will force you to have to separate your ideas or your perspective from their perspective.
Mhm.
And I think that might be related. That might be a cognitive challenge for autistic people is, that's what they're failing to do. Is
Yeah,
they're not making that separation.
yeah, it always seems to be the main issue with autism. That's what we observe most. There are certain repetitive behaviors, like autistic children often like line up toys and they find that fun. But there's also sensory issues, almost always. And that's why many autistic people like pressure on their body. It helps them manage their sensations. Or certain they manage their sensations. So there's a perceptual aspect as well that affects their sensitivity to different things, different sensations.
You think this is related to the phenomenon of psychological projection, where people don't really entertain the idea that someone else might think differently than them, and they just project their own psychology onto the other person?
From the perspective of who, the person with autism, or
So, well, it wouldn't necessarily be someone with autism. It's just psychological projection. So,
yeah,
like if you just don't focus on the fact that someone else has their own psychology and motivation and purpose in life, and you just take what they're doing and then assume that it's their motive is what your motive would be in that case, and so you project what your motive would be onto them. Do you think that's related to this problem of
I think so. At least broadly speaking. I mean, that is a similar question. I mean, is projection that is a form of thinking about how others think. What is it that they think based on what you think, or what could others think? I think it is related because when you think about that, you need to narrow down your choices, come up with theories about why people think the way they do, and all things like that. So it takes a lot of cognitive effort to figure that out, whether right or wrong. The projection would take a lot of effort, a lot of thinking. So you could easily see how if somebody autistic has difficulty with social issues, it just multiplies and like adds stress and makes difficult to think. It adds ambiguity to their speech, or harder to understand, or harder to relate to people. It just builds on itself.
okay, so let's move on to examples of autistic people. So we have some famous examples. Like recently, Elon Musk said he has Asperger's syndrome, and some possible examples of, like, people think Einstein was autistic, and maybe Steve Jobs. Can you think of any
Mozart,
interesting famous examples? Mozart, yeah.
people say that, but I'm skeptical of that one. Who else? It's so speculative. We will never know because it's just what people report about the person. I mean, like Beethoven has some interesting stories about him that he might be autistic even, but it could be just because he liked to be an asshole, not because he had autism. And there's a difference between choosing not to understand people and being unable to. So it's hard to distinguish usually.
Yeah. Did you ever notice Elon Musk having eye contact problems? Because that's one of the things he mentioned when he made
Yeah,
his.
his eye contact is always a little weird to me. He's never like what I'd be used to if I see him in interviews. But that might just be a bias on my part. I'm not really even sure. He's odd anyway, so because he's such a weird person that it's hard to even judge that anyway. Sometimes it's just like he's idiosyncratic. Not that he's autistic per se.
What do you make of the eye contact or lack of eye contact? Is because one of the theories I have is that if they have a great memory, they wouldn't need to look at you.
Yeah,
They would get distracted by staring at you, because why stare at someone when you have a great memory and you already know what they look like? And It's maybe he needs to look at other things while he's talking to people, because his mind is so active that he needs other stimulus.
Well, I'll answer that through this. So many spectrum disorders, even average normal people, can express certain traits of that spectrum. Any person could have traits of ADHD or schizophrenia on a wider scale if you make a spectrum of certain traits. So it's not like you either have the disorder or you don't. Sometimes it's like you show more traits than another person. Same with autism. So I've never been diagnosed with autism or anything, but I do relate to some of the symptoms, especially the eye contact thing, really just the eye contact thing. But it's not because, just as a neurotypical person, I don't like eye contact because it makes me think too much. Like I feel like I overanalyze what the person is thinking, the things on their face, their facial expressions. It's a lot of information there. So I don't always look at them. So as I look away, it's easier to think. In the same way you might like close your eyes to imagine something. So it's reducing the stimuli, helps you think. And I like to think abstractly. So if I'm trying to look at the facial features and all that, it's a real distraction and thinking it's harder. So I think it's related to that, where it's like a stimulus overload for autistic people. So it's an adaptation to just look away.
Yeah, I kind of relate to that too. I don't have an eye contact issue, but I am very aware of the distraction a face can present in distracting you from thinking of other things. Like if I'm trying to focus on some complex idea and I'm looking at someone, that requires focal energy. And so now I'm splitting my consciousness between my introspective thoughts and my extrospective analysis of that face or evaluation of the face. And if it happens to be like a beautiful woman, that's even more distracting, because now I'm just thinking of how beautiful she is. I'm trying to think of like, why is there no life on Mars or something? It's like some crazy idea you have. You want to focus on that. So you got to look away. Sometimes you got to look away from the beautiful woman.
Yeah.
And just start and focus on what you got to focus on. So I understand that. Admittedly, I probably look at the woman instead, but yeah. So that's one connection. One normal thing that autistic people have in connection with neurotypicals. Another thing I thought of was a characteristic of autistic people is that they repeat behaviors a lot. And like you mentioned, stacking toys, or sometimes they'll flap their hands, or you do repetitive behaviors that help them stimulate themselves and keep themselves busy and entertained. And that reminds me of like superstitious baseball players who, before they get into the batter's box, they'll do some crazy routine where they touch all their body parts in a certain way and then swing the bat around and do weird things. And pitchers will do that sometimes too, as they'll have a routine on the mound before they get pitched. So that's an interesting thing. And maybe some of those players are autistic, I don't know, but I think they can't all be autistic. So I just think that people in general, even rituals, like religious rituals, that's a form of repetition and doing the same thing over and over and over again.
It is.
And so we've, to some extent, society has institutionalized, repetitive mimicking. Mimicking is an inherent trait of learning. That's an interesting connection between autistic behavior. It seems like the autistic person is taking this mimicking to an abnormal degree.
Sometimes I disagree. I think it's not so much mimicking as much as maybe a obsessive behavior. Well, I think I thought of it once as preferring to think about inanimate things because it's easier. And inanimate things are, you can do manipulate how you want. You could make things ordered, organized, because everything else is chaotic. That's a bit reading into it, but I think that makes more sense. And I think a repetitive or obsessive thing, to me, it seems more adaptive, that there's a purpose to it. Unlike OCD, which its purpose is only to, I don't know, make the person just feel at ease, but it accomplishes nothing to do those rituals. But at least for the child with autism, these apparent rituals are still provide learning of some sort, some control of things and objects. So they are learning something, even if it is repetitive.
You think it's that they have a goal and they get kind of stuck doing that repetitive behavior in order to achieve the goal over and over and over again?
Probably something along those lines. Autism always seems like not something like a failure to have any thinking, but a difficulty of thinking. I don't know if I'm explaining that right, but it's more like a adaptive issue, that there's always an adaptation, but it's just that they're lacking capacity. Like, I don't know if you're born without an arm. Anything you do is just a adaptation. It's not caused by the arm per se, but your adaptation to lacking the arm. It's not like lacking an arm makes people, I know, fearful of you or apprehensive of you. It's the being different, or it's the, you have to act differently by nature of lacking that arm. So in similar with autism, like, it's not that you're always lacking an ability, or just that you need to act in a certain way to make use of what you have.
Let's move on to some fictional examples. I thought of a few autistic characters in movies. A famous one is in Rain Man. Dustin Hoffman plays a savant type. And one of the things he does is he repeats words or phrases over and over. And I guess this is a form of echolalia. Do you think that echolalia is a misunderstood or a clearly understood feature of autism?
Medically, I don't know. But in popular culture, I would think it's mostly not understood. I think it's more like eye contact. I think it's similar that although it's a weird adaptation compared to a neurotypical, it is a way to deal with excessive stimulus and a way to control your stimuli so you're not overwhelmed.
You think it indicates a feature of their cognition, which would be they just have repetitive thoughts over and over? Or is it more of like an impulse issue where they can't stop themselves from vocalizing their thoughts?
I can say I'm unsure. I don't think there's evidence to think so, but I don't think there's enough to rule that out, because I'm not sure if their repetitive thoughts might be to do with why it's difficult to think about social things, or maybe not. It might just seem repetitive, but it's not. I mean, neurotypical people do things that might seem repetitive to others, but they themselves don't. Like, some people think gardening is repetitive and boring. I mean, but once you didn't go to the next, and what's the difference? But the person gardening sees a huge amount of difference. They see every seed is different, or every plant is a unique experience. Or the everyday gardening is going to be a little different, that most people wouldn't see just because they don't care much about it. I think it's something just like that.
So there's a similarity between echolalia and Tourette's, but Tourette's, my understanding from studying it a bit, is that it's more like a reflex that they don't have control over.
Yeah.
It's like an impulse that overwhelms them.
Yeah, it's basically the opposite of Parkinson's, it deals with the same brain region. They both have an issue in the basal ganglia, which is pretty much right in the middle of the brain on the inside. So they have problems there, just different neurotransmitters, I think.
Think there's any connection between the impulse control problem with Tourette's and any aspect of autistic behavior?
I'm not sure about MRI studies with autistic people. That'd be a question of where the most activity is detected. And if it was in the frontal lobe, that would be more like it's not about an issue with their brain. It could be impulse control. I mean, there could be impulse control in the sense that your deliberate will can control it. There's also impulse control as far as how do your muscles move with any relation to your thinking. I mean, you can't control things caused by the basal ganglia going haywire, but you could control things to an extent in your frontal lobe. So if the frontal lobe has an issue, that would mean that you'll have more issue with holding back. And if it's normal, of course, you'll have normal function to hold back. But the question would be is there abnormal function of the frontal lobe in autistic people? That would be the question, which I don't know.
Another example from the movies is The Accountant.
Oh, yeah.
Ben Affleck plays an autistic character. And one of the things you were talking about is how autistic people will massage themselves.
Mhm.
And that is done in The Accountant. He takes this stick and massages his leg with it. Another thing he does in the movie is at night, he turns on this loud music and strobe lights, and it's like he's in some discotheque or something. Obviously, that's some sort of stimming ritual he's doing, or maybe he's trying to condition himself to the loud noise and lights of society so he doesn't freak out in public. What do you think about that?
It seems interesting. Good adaptations, I think. Although odd, of course. I mean, to me, it's like I saw that movie, but the music's so loud. To me, that would give me like a panic attack. But in a way, I could see that the excessive stimuli is like to overblow your sensory stuff can almost be relaxing. I'm not sure why. Seems, but it's believable.
Yeah, it's not really, I don't think it was explained in the movie. I can't recall whether he got into it because it's a very introspective movie where he doesn't really do a lot of talking or explaining why he's doing things. So that was a weird feature that I thought was perhaps significant. But another example is The Good Doctor, a TV show about an autistic doctor who has trouble with eye contact and social skills. And then you mentioned to me on a Netflix show, Atypical. I haven't seen that show, but I did watch a trailer for it. So I guess it's about a high school kid who is into girls, but he's got autism and has trouble relating. Do you have anything particular to say about that show?
It's just a comedy, but I mean, it's interesting. A few episodes if you're curious about the way autistic people behave, or you're curious about in the context of high school. But other than that, it's standard comedy. I wouldn't say anything special about it, other than it's just a modern example that is probably more fair portrayal than others in the past, than say 30 years ago.
One of the clips I watched from Atypical is the main character in class taking a test with his fellow students, and the teacher says you have to, I guess it's a verbal test. You have to say something before the end of class or you fail the test.
Yeah.
So this kid is sitting there struggling to say something and can't say anything during the whole class while his fellow students are chiming in with their thoughts.
Yeah.
So I guess that's an example of his lack of social skills. And that's kind of typical for autistic depictions in movies
Yeah.
and TV. Do you have any thoughts on like tropes and like false generalizations about autistic people in fictional film and TV?
Probably that they're just aloof, which they're not any more aloof than anyone else would be. Um, it might seem that way because to be aloof usually is just not to show your social expression. But if you have difficulty in social settings, you might just not show it because you're distracted or busy with thinking about other things. But any autistic person describes that they do have a rich emotional life, that they don't lack emotions or lack the ability to feel. It's just the ability to understand what other people think, which does make it harder to know what emotions to show. Because any person knows that you don't always wear your emotions on your sleeve, or you just change how you demonstrate your emotions or just control it. But imagine you couldn't understand emotions well from other people. You might want to hide it or not know how to show it. I think it's more like that. But yeah, they'll always describe that they do have rich emotions. It's just the expression or the understanding emotions is what's difficult. Like conceptually understanding.
One thing that I read in an article, let me get the quote. It's an independent article by Florence Grant from May of this year. She was responding to Elon Musk's announcement that he has Asperger's. She's kind of like a political autistic person saying that autism shouldn't be considered a mental disorder. It should just be accepted, accommodated by society. And one of the quotes she gives is that she says, at a very young age, I realized that people didn't like me being myself. So I began to observe others and copy them so I could be accepted. This is called masking.
Mm-hmm.
So this kind of sounds like what you were talking about, where they aren't aloof to what's going on. They perhaps trying to mask their inability to communicate, just trying to deal with their inner emotions. What do you make of that quote?
Yeah, I think it confirms that, but also makes me wonder. Always that feeling of like, why do you need to care about what they think? Okay, they don't like you. They think you're weird. Big deal. That's how I feel. Like, yeah, I mean, they're gonna think you're weird. You've got autism. You just accept that. Like, those people aren't like, if they don't understand you or don't want to, then why would you care? They're not good people to you. I mean, if they're good people, then they'll give you at least some chance to express yourself, or they'll just leave you be. But I don't see why she needs to be like on people about it. Like, it would be nice to be accepted, but what can you expect of people? I mean, I don't know, you can expect them to just treat you the same. That's my first thought about it.
So there is the phenomenon of trying to be socially acceptable, fitting in with the crowd, getting along with people. So I can understand an autistic person, wanting to fit in. And if they feel like they can't fit in being themselves, then they have to change their behavior. And then they call that masking, because
Yeah.
they're not being their true selves, or they're not being who they really
Yes.
want to be. I like some people, I'm sure, don't want to go to work in a suit, but they do it in order to, fit in with everyone else wearing a suit and,
I would call
play.
that masking too. I mean, what she's describing almost is not even like autism unique. That's common to many people. You'll very often need to mask something. Or if you do, it's that same issue are you sacrificing yourself for the crowd? I mean, that's always the same question. Autistic or not, you're always faced with that question.
Relating to autistic people, the problem is they don't fit in. Like this woman in the article continued saying basically that they still thought she was weird, even though she tried to mask. And so this whole masking was very painful and exhausting for her. And
Yeah, it would
so
be.
that's why she's developed this political stance that, just be yourself if you're autistic and don't, and that society should learn to accommodate them. So that, I guess it's kind of like the trans issue is if you're a transgender, you want to just come out and be yourself and you don't want the stigma that society brings on you, which makes sense. I mean, if that's the way you feel and you're not harming anybody, then why should people put you down for that? So I understand that and I sympathize with that. Do you have any other additional thoughts before we move on from that?
No. Yeah, I agree with you.
And so the main therapy is ABA, applied behavior analysis, but we don't have to get into that. People can look that up for themselves.
Yeah.
But I know you were talking about prosthetics when we were talking about curing aging, and this came up as a potential cure for autism as well.
Yeah.
Have you heard anything about prosthetics being used to help autistic people with their cognitive processes?
Not that I know of directly. I've heard of systems being used to help autistic people identify emotions or behaviors using AI and I guess smartphones, but nothing in particular. I mean, I know there's tools of communication, like there's these boards where a facilitator helps the autistic person like use a board to point out words or phrases. It's those that have trouble with verbal communication. It helps them communicate. It's something like that maybe Stephen Hawking used a long time ago when he had to communicate words with just his eyes. But I don't know anything beyond that.
Okay. Well, in terms of ABA, just one quick thing is it seems like they treat the patients using very like behaviorism tactics, like a stimulus, response, reward, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, which might make sense because if autistic people who are severely disabled function like basically like an animal, a pre 3 or 4 year old, then you'd have to treat them that way, because in order to train them to learn proper behaviors and thinking, if they can't do it themselves naturally, then you'd have to intervene and do some sort of conditioning on them.
To some extent, yeah.
That I think that's probably why it seems to be the most effective treatment, which makes a lot of sense to me. So we could talk about that some other time, though.
Yeah.
One, just in conclusion, real quick conclusion, like a big picture thing that I notice is that there's a high functioning autism that includes excellent memory. That's depicted in Rain Man.
Mm-hmm.
This might indicate like a significant feature of autism in that they have a very concrete bound cognitive process or cognition, where they maybe lack skills for imagination, and they are just super skilled in skills for memorization. So there might be an imbalance or abnormality there in the balance between memory and imagination.
Yeah, there's a real possibility of that. I think legitimate evidence too. If anybody's curious about the book Mind of a Mnemonist, is a good way to look into that, how concrete thinking relates to memory ability. It's a very interesting book.
Yeah, and if that is the main issue, that would explain their problems with interacting with other people and imagining, the Sally Ann test, imagining what the perspective of someone else, because they can't imagine it. They don't have a memory of the other person's perspective.
Yeah.
You can't have a memory of someone else's perspective. So
Yeah.
that would explain it.
Yeah.
So that's all I have for now. Thanks a lot, and I'll talk to you next time.
Yep. Bye, everyone.